On a rainy spring night in the year, officers from the Scott County Sheriff's Office responded to an accident scene about 11 km north of downtown Davenport, Iowa. The driver of a car had crashed into a post. Fortunately, no one was injured. At first glance, everything looked like an ordinary case of drunk driving. But when the driver came to, the situation took a disturbing turn. At first, he was confused in his statements. But soon he remembered and told something that shocked the police officers. The 31-year-old local resident named Christopher Lee Beal could not explain where he was or where he came from. At some point, he suspected that he was in a hospital. When asked where he came from, he answered that he could remember neither his home nor his address or other places. To determine if the man had injuries, a police officer examined the interior of the car. No alcohol bottles or prohibited substances were found, but on the floor next to Christopher's feet lay a knife, which raised the alarm. He was barefoot, one of them bloody. When asked where his shoes were, the man just shrugged his shoulders. He could not remember where he came from and what he had done before the accident. While the rain pattered on the roadside, Lieutenant Leonard took the knife from the interior and placed it on the roof of the car. The blade was covered in blood, which was, however, immediately washed away by the rain. Christopher had a small wound on his side, but nothing serious. At this time, the officers assumed that he had cut himself accidentally. The vehicle registration confirmed that it belonged to Christopher Beal. The address in the papers pointed to the Crestview apartment complex in Parkwood, where Christopher lived with his girlfriend, 31-year-old Taylor Lee McCreas. The deputy sheriff named Turner drove to their apartment and knocked on the door, but no one opened. It was silent, no sound was to be heard. The attempt to reach Taylor via the found phone number remained unsuccessful. From the outside, everything looked quiet. There were no signs of disturbance or danger. Since Turner could not discover anything suspicious, he decided not to go inside and returned to Davenport, where Christopher was lying in the hospital at that time. There he was treated for minor injuries and severe alcohol poisoning. At the medical facility, Christopher was read his rights and an alcohol test was performed. For this, a special method for tracking vertical eye movement was used. In this process, the movement of the subject's eyes is observed while the head remains motionless. In the first phase, Christopher found it difficult to hold his head still, but after a few attempts, he was able to follow the instructions. The behavior of his eyes confirmed the signs of intoxication. A subsequent blood test revealed an alcohol content that was 4 times over the legal limit. Christopher showed no severe head injuries or signs of a concussion. The doctors diagnosed only alcohol poisoning, a superficial cut on the side, and a low potassium level in the body. Gradually, he began to speak more clearly, but his memory did not yet return. He could not explain how the knife had gotten into the interior of the car. He seemed to vaguely suspect that there was an explanation for it, but could not remember it. When Deputy Sheriff Turner began to ask further questions about the found knife, Christopher became restless. He asked if his hands had been blood-stained when he was brought to the hospital. Most of all, he was worried by a question of whether everything was all right with his girlfriend Taylor. He claimed that she had not answered the phone at night before either, but insisted that someone from the staff return to her apartment and personally verify that everything was all right with her. Eventually, Christopher admitted that terrible images were going through his head, and he was afraid that he had done something to her. He said he did not believe he could do such a thing, as it was not in his nature. But images appeared in his head of him striking with a baseball bat. This thought triggered panic in him. He said he was not sure if that had really happened, but he absolutely wanted someone to check if Taylor was still alive. After the conversation with him, Officer Leonard drove again to the Crestview apartment complex, where Christopher and Taylor's apartment was located. This time, the officers tried to open the door of apartment number 4. It was not locked, but something prevented it from opening. When they were able to open the door a crack, it became clear that the passage was blocked by Taylor's body, which lay in the doorway. She showed no signs of life. The crime was extremely brutal. Inside the apartment, police officers found numerous signs of a struggle. Taylor had injuries caused by a baseball bat, a knife, and a screwdriver. In total, almost 60 wounds were counted. Signs of the struggle were found in several areas of the two-room apartment, in the hallway, in the kitchen, in the living room, and finally in the area of the entrance door. On the sofa in the kitchen area lay a blood-stained bat. Next to the sink lay the broken tip of a screwdriver. The knife that had previously been secured by Officer Leonard had also been used. Although the rain had washed away some of the blood traces, DNA analysis confirmed that the blood came from Taylor. Taylor was the daughter of Michael Markey and Lisa Rosenberg. She was born in 1993 and grew up in Davenport, Iowa. She attended the local high school. After graduation, she began working in a beauty salon, initially as an assistant. Then she completed training as a manicurist. Taylor became a mother early. She had 2 children, Layla and Julian. However, it is not clear from available sources exactly where her children were living at the time of her death. Taylor's private life was not particularly happy. Men came and went because they could not stand her independence or, on the contrary, hurt her. Her family remembered Taylor as an open and sincere woman who could laugh from the heart, loved cooking, and cherished time with her loved ones. Despite her bright character, Taylor struggled with addiction throughout her entire adult life. During her treatment, she met Christopher. He also came from Davenport and worked on the side as a cameraman in production. They met at a rehabilitation center in Buffalo. During the program, they attended classes together, worked on overcoming their addiction, and gradually grew closer. Their relationship turned romantic. In October, they officially announced that they were a couple. After completing rehab, they moved in together immediately, but the very next day after their discharge, both started drinking alcohol again. The relationship between Christopher Beal and Taylor was not easy. It was a relationship marked by contradictions, in which love and affection were often accompanied by tensions and outbursts of aggression. Taylor told her friends several times that Christopher became very short-tempered, especially after consuming alcohol. Although he was attentive to her when sober, he lost control of himself in a drunken state, and Taylor felt like she was walking on a knife's edge. Nevertheless, she stayed with him, justifying this by saying she believed in his inner goodness, hoped for change, and was of the opinion that everyone should be given a chance. There were times when things actually got better. Christopher went to work, they planned their future together and discussed moving. But after such good phases, a renewed crash followed every time: arguments, scenes of jealousy, accusations. According to acquaintances, Christopher had a possessive character and was often of the opinion that Taylor had to submit to his will. Nevertheless, the young woman did not go to the police and tried not to carry the disputes to the outside world. She wrote messages to her friends in which she hinted at her concern but said that she would manage it. Her circle knew. Taylor was one of those people who believe until the very end that they can change the situation and the person by their side. In letters to her relatives shortly before the tragedy, she admitted that she feared for her safety but asked not to tell anyone. Their relationship was characterized by fear, hope, and inner contradictions. It was an emotional trap from which Taylor could not escape despite her awareness of the danger. Christopher Beal was born on September 5, 1993, in Iowa into a family that, as it turned out, existed only out of habit. His father worked as a welder, was often on business trips, and came back irritable and smelling of alcohol. His mother suffered from depression and spent most of her time in her bedroom, from which the sound of an old television emanated. An uneasy silence reigned in the house, which could be interrupted by screams at any moment. Christopher learned early in his childhood what it means to hide from family arguments in the closet. At school, he was a quiet, tense teenager. The teachers said he was intelligent but could not work in a team. One of them remembered how Christopher had once painted a picture in which a man was on fire but smiling. Even then, the darkness in him could be felt. In high school, he began to drink alcohol, which he had tried for the first time at 13 years old. He had stolen a bottle from his father and drunk it alone in the basement. After school, Beal tried to enroll in a car mechanic course at a college but dropped out after half a year. He had trouble dealing with the pressure and went off the rails more and more often. For a while he worked in a car repair shop, then in a warehouse and on the side as a courier. He couldn't stay anywhere longer than a few months. At one place he was fired after an incident with a customer whom he had threatened. That was when his colleagues first suspected that he had mental health problems. The doctors diagnosed Christopher with borderline personality disorder with signs of paranoid thinking. However, he refused therapy, claiming all psychiatrists were lying and trying to get inside his head. Over time, he developed auditory hallucinations. He told that he heard his neighbors talking about him and that someone was whispering under his window at night. His relationships with women were unstable. From passion to aggression was only one step. In one of his previous relationships, according to his ex-partner, he once smashed the refrigerator door and broke the TV, only to then sit weeping on her lap and say that he was afraid of himself. When he met Taylor, she became an anchor for him. He called her his hero and said she was the only one who understood what was going on inside him. But gradually, the old pattern repeated itself. He controlled her, was jealous, checked her phone, and forced her to delete all men from her social networks. Sometimes he disappeared for several days, then came back with gifts and promised that everything would be different. Shortly before the tragedy, he lost touch with reality more and more, claimed he was being followed, and asked Taylor to cover the mirrors and not look into them after midnight. On the day of the crime, according to friends, he was quiet and withdrawn and behaved quite strangely. In the apartment where the tragedy occurred, investigators found only isolated clues that give an approximate impression of what happened in the last minutes before the brutal attack on Taylor. There was nothing unusual in the closets in the bedroom. On the bedside tables stood knickknacks and on the floor lay a bag. In the bathroom there were no signs of cleaning. In the master bedroom, however, next to the pillow lay an almost empty plastic bottle of vodka. On the sheet, a small bloodstain could be seen, which presumably came from a touch with a finger. The cap of the bottle and Christopher's cell phone also lay on the bed. The second phone, which belonged to Taylor, was found in the kitchen. On the night of the tragedy, Taylor tried to reach two acquaintances via Facebook Messenger. The first was Michael Holland. She asked him to pick her up. This had happened before. Michael had already helped her several times. He spoke with her on the phone that night and noticed that she was emotional and had probably been drinking. He himself had also had a few glasses and therefore refused to get behind the wheel. He tried to order her a taxi via Uber, but the ride to his house would have cost $50, which was too expensive. He promised to pick her up the next morning, but she did not call back. The second message for help Taylor sent to a classmate named Nick. It was already after 11 p.m. Nick did not see the message until the morning around 7 a.m. Taylor wrote that Christopher was to blame if something happened to her. Then she added that he should not answer because Christopher was behaving inappropriately. Nevertheless, she did not call emergency services. Christopher was arrested while he was still in the hospital. After being taken into custody, he was brought to the station where he was interrogated by the police. At the time of the interrogation, he was already sober again. Without a lawyer, he began to remember fragments of the events. Within a few hours, he told two different versions. In one, he claimed that he and Taylor had been playing cards. At some point, Taylor had started acting emotional. He had tried to calm her down and they had lain down on the bed together. According to his statements, he could remember almost nothing until he had smashed the front door with a baseball bat. Christopher remembered how Taylor went into the kitchen and panicked. He did not understand what she was doing and tried to take the bat away from her. Then she ran into the living room. He remembered the further events only vaguely. He said he remembered roughly how he had taken the baseball bat and hit her. Otherwise, his memories were fragmentary. He could not reconstruct a clear sequence of events. Christopher said that after the incident, he stood there confused and considered whether he should return to the bedroom or just take the keys and leave. Christopher reported that after leaving the apartment, he could not remember anything until he woke up in the hospital. He could not explain to the investigators what exactly had prompted him to attack Taylor. According to his statements, there were indeed difficulties in their relationship. He felt that Taylor was cold towards him and gave him to understand that he was not part of her life. She had often reproached him and belittled him, which is why Christopher felt superfluous. Nevertheless, he claimed that he loved her and tried to save the relationship. The investigators left Christopher alone for a while to discuss how to proceed. His description did not match what they had seen at the crime scene. In particular, he did not mention the events in the hallway and in the kitchen. Although the traces clearly indicated that the attack had begun in one part of the apartment and then shifted to other rooms until it ended at the front door. Regarding the knife, he only remembered that he had sustained a cut from it. He knew nothing at all about a screwdriver. He explained that alcohol had destroyed his life and he did not understand how he could do such a thing. Christopher remembered that he and Taylor had not been drinking together for the first time, but previously it had never come to such incidents. He was at a loss as to why everything had happened on this particular night. When the interrogation continued, the investigators put Christopher under pressure and asked him to fill the gaps in his statement. Then he began to make conjectures. Possibly after the beatings had gone too far, he had stabbed Taylor with a knife to end her suffering. He himself was not sure of this version, as his memories of that night were blurred. The investigators pointed out discrepancies between his statements and the physical evidence. Blood traces were found not only on the baseball bat and the knife, but also in other places in the apartment, indicating that the attack had taken place in several locations. Christopher could not explain why the blood was in these places. He claimed again not to remember using the screwdriver but did not rule out that it might have been used. In court, Christopher was charged with first-degree murder. To prove his guilt, the prosecution had to demonstrate that the defendant's actions were malicious and premeditated. The defense admitted the act. He had inflicted fatal injuries on Taylor. Forensic medicine determined that death had occurred due to one of the numerous blows, but it was not possible to determine exactly which one. Christopher claimed he had been in a state of drunkenness to the point of complete memory loss. The lawyers insisted that in this state he was not capable of consciously planning his actions or having malicious intentions. However, the decision on the classification of the crime was left to the jury. Although there was no evidence that he had planned the crime in advance or tried to cover up tracks, this did not mean that Christopher did not act consciously, which he was accused of. For a conviction, it was not necessary for Christopher to be able to remember the events. The number of injuries inflicted on Taylor indicated a prolonged attack, during which he would have had enough time to stop. Each injury could be viewed as a separate conscious act. The use of 3 different objects, a baseball bat, a knife, and a screwdriver, also suggested that the act was not committed spontaneously but intentionally. Although all the murder weapons were in the apartment, Christopher had to switch them at least twice during the attack. The physical evidence indicated that the incident had occurred in several areas of the apartment. The attack began in one place and continued in other rooms, which pointed to targeted actions. After the deed, he left the apartment, which indicated an awareness of the consequences. The medical examiner, Dr. Dennis Cleaney, who performed the autopsy, confirmed that the cause of death was multiple blunt force injuries. The prosecution insisted that Taylor's death was the result of the general nature of the attack. The expert could not say exactly which blow was fatal. The prosecutors drew the jury's attention to the stab wounds, especially those that, according to Christopher himself, were the last ones when he stabbed her in the chest. However, the expert pointed out that some of the injuries could have been caused by a fall. This possibility could not be completely ruled out. The analysis showed that Taylor had a significant amount of alcohol in her blood. The defense insisted that one of the first blows could have been fatal, and the subsequent injuries had no influence on the legal assessment of the incident. Therefore, in the view of the defense, the premeditation of every single act was not decisive. Christopher testified in court in his own defense. This was probably his only chance to present what happened as a tragedy caused by a sudden outburst of emotion, and not as a cold-bloodedly planned act. Under oath, he changed his statement again. Now he could no longer remember using a knife. He claimed the last thing he could remember was that they had been lying in bed and talking. Previously, he had told that Taylor had allegedly grabbed a knife and injured him, whereupon he had pushed her away and taken a baseball bat. Now he denied this version completely and admitted to having invented it. At the same time, he confirmed that there had indeed been blows with the baseball bat and that Taylor, as far as he could remember, had been standing with her back to him during one of them. When asked about his confession during the interrogation that he had used a knife, he answered that he had really believed at the time that this had happened. According to his statements, he wanted to end her suffering, as he had already inflicted numerous injuries on her. In his closing argument, Christopher's lead attorney Miguel Pantes resorted to an unusual comparison again. Contrary to the prosecution's assertion that each of the nearly 60 wounds had been a separate conscious decision, the defense explained that the defendant's actions could not be divided into several episodes, but represented a single continuous impulsive behavior. Attorney Pantes ended his speech by portraying the crime as a single continuous action and comparing it to such everyday things as walking or eating. According to his words, a person does not think about every step or every bite when walking or eating. He just does it. In a similar way, according to Pantes, Christopher's actions that evening were not a sequence of well-considered decisions, but the result of a single emotional impulse in which he was immersed and which he could no longer stop. He suspected that everything had happened very quickly. According to his version, the attack began and ended in the kitchen. Pantes emphasized that there were no indications that Taylor was able to move within the apartment after the conflict began, which in his opinion indicated her almost immediate death. He also pointed out that actions committed after death cannot be classified as first-degree crimes, since intent cannot arise retrospectively. In this case, it is a different offense that was not considered within the scope of the charges. Deputy District Attorney for Scott County Brad Larson disagreed with this interpretation. He reminded the jurors that the evidence at the crime scene contradicted this version. Furthermore, the second version of Christopher's statement, which he had made during the interrogation, matched the findings at the crime scene completely. Larson reminded them that Christopher, when investigators pressured him, had confessed to possibly stabbing Taylor with a knife to end her suffering. The prosecutor emphasized that the defendant himself had said he had done this consciously, as he was aware of the victim's condition after the previous injuries. These words, according to the prosecution, were clear proof of the intent to complete the act and thus of the existence of premeditation. He asked the jurors to consider which of Christopher's versions actually corresponded to the facts. He reminded them that the first story the defendant had told had been described as fabricated by himself, while the second version, in which he confessed to using all the murder weapons, fully matched the evidence at the crime scene. After 2 hours of deliberation, the jury reached their verdict. Christopher was found guilty of first-degree murder. In addition, he was found guilty of willful injury causing serious bodily injury. The sentence for the first count automatically provides for life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The final sentencing is scheduled for May 30, 2025. It is expected that at this hearing several family members, including Taylor's mother Lisa, will comment on the consequences of the tragedy. Thanks for watching and take care of yourselves.